The bright lights of Stellar Academy's hallways did nothing to warm Lyra's spirit as she walked quickly between classes, keeping her head down. Her pale blue skin and smaller frame made her stand out among the other Australian students, whose deep azure complexions and tall statures marked them as pure members of their species. "Look who it is," a loud voice echoed through the corridor. "The defect is trying to sneak by again." Lyra clutched her data pad tighter to her chest, her steps quickening. The owner of the voice, Dax, stood nearly 2 heads taller than her. His group of friends spread out, blocking her path to the quantum physics classroom. "I don't want any trouble," Lyra said softly, her voice barely audible in the busy hallway. The other students passing by turned their faces away, pretending not to notice. This was a common enough scene at the prestigious Space Station Academy. "Trouble?" Dax laughed, his antenna twitching in amusement. "You're the trouble. Look at you, can't even grow proper antenna like a real Australian. What's wrong with you?" The truth was, Lyra didn't know what was wrong with her. Her mother, Mai, never spoke about why she looked different. Every time Lyra asked about her father, Mai would change the subject, or suddenly remember an urgent repair job somewhere on the station. "The Academy has standards," one of Dax's friends chimed in. "You're only here because your mother fixes the waste processors." The group laughed, their blue faces darkening with mirth. Lyra felt her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. She'd learned early that crying only made things worse. Instead, she gripped her data pad tighter, her knuckles turning almost white against her pale blue skin. Just then, a deep voice cut through the taunts. "Is there a problem here?" Professor Val, a tall Meridian with silver scales, stood watching the scene with his 4 eyes narrowed. "No problem, Professor," Dax said smoothly, his antenna falling flat in false respect. "Just having a friendly chat with our unique classmate." Professor Val's top set of eyes focused on Lyra, while his bottom set stayed fixed on the group. "Then I suggest you all get to class. The quantum field isn't going to study itself." The bullies dispersed, but not before Dax whispered, "See you later, defect." Later that evening, Lyra sat in the small quarters she shared with her mother on the lower levels of the station. Mai was still working, as usual. The repair crews always seemed to need her expertise with the station's complex systems. Looking at her reflection in the worn metal wall, Lyra studied her features for the 1000th time. Why were her eyes rounder than other Australians? Why was she so much shorter? Why did she lack the delicate antenna that adorned every other member of her species? The door hissed open, and Mai walked in, her work uniform stained with engine grease. She took one look at her daughter's face and sighed. "Bad day." Lyra just nodded, not wanting to worry her mother more than necessary. But inside, she felt the question that had haunted her for 16 years burning stronger than ever. What was she really? The science lab buzzed with activity as students worked on their anti-gravity experiments. Lyra sat alone at her station, carefully adjusting the field generator's controls. While other students struggled to maintain their test objects in a stable hover, her small metal sphere floated perfectly still. "That's unusual," Professor Val said, appearing beside her workstation. "Most students take weeks to achieve that level of stability." All 4 of his eyes studied the readouts on her control panel. "I just feel it," Lyra explained quietly. "Like I can sense how the field wants to flow." A crash from across the room interrupted their conversation. Dax had lost control of his experiment, sending equipment scattering across the floor. As he bent to pick up the pieces, he glared at Lyra. "Show off," he muttered, just loud enough for nearby students to hear. "Probably cheating somehow." But Professor Val wasn't listening to Dax. He was still examining Lyra's work with growing interest. "Your reaction time in adjusting the field is remarkable. Almost human-like in its speed." The word made several students look up. Humans were practically a myth now, stories told to scare children. Dangerous beings from a forbidden part of space who could survive almost anything and adapt to any challenge. Later that day, in physical training class, Lyra discovered another strange ability. During the reflex tests, she not only matched but exceeded the scores of her pure Australian classmates. Her body seemed to react before her mind could process what was happening. Impossible. Kex, another of her tormentors, spat out. The machine must be broken. But 3 different machines showed the same results. That evening, while walking back to her quarters, Lyra heard footsteps behind her. Her newly discovered reflexes screamed danger, and she spun around just in time to dodge a thrown container of cleaning fluid. Fast little freak, aren't you? Dax emerged from the shadows, followed by Kex and 2 others. Let's see how quick you really are. They rushed at her from different directions, but something strange happened. Time seemed to slow down. Lyra could see their movements as if they were swimming through thick liquid. She ducked under Kex's grab, twisted away from Dax's push, and somehow ended up behind all of them. The bullies stood there, stunned. No Australian should have been able to move like that. What are you? Dax's voice shook slightly. Lyra ran, her heart pounding. She didn't stop until she reached home, bursting through the door to find her mother talking to someone on a secure comm channel. Mai quickly cut the transmission. Mom, Lyra gasped, still trying to catch her breath. Something's happening to me. I can do things that shouldn't be possible. May's face went pale, her blue skin turning almost white. Sit down, sweetheart. There's something we need to talk about. She paused, looking at her daughter with worried eyes. But first, tell me exactly what happened today. For the first time in her life, Lyra saw real fear in her mother's eyes. Not fear of her, but fear for her. Whatever was happening, her mother knew more than she'd been telling. The Academy's annual science exhibition was Lyra's chance to prove herself. For weeks, she worked on her project, a modified shield generator that could adapt to different types of energy attacks. Her natural understanding of the technology made the work flow easily, even as she tried to hide how quickly she grasped complex concepts. The morning of the exhibition, Lyra arrived early to set up her display. The large hall was still empty, the soft hum of power systems the only sound. Her project stood ready, its sleek design drawing attention even among the other impressive inventions. Well, if it isn't the station's little mystery, Dax's voice echoed through the hall. He and Kex emerged from behind a large plasma display. Quite a fancy project you've got there. Lyra's enhanced reflexes sensed danger, but she stood her ground. Leave it alone, Dax. Professor Val already approved all the safety protocols. Safety protocols. Kex laughed. That's rich, coming from someone who shouldn't even be here. He moved toward the control panel of her shield generator. Stop. Lyra lunged forward, but Dax blocked her path. We're just making some improvements. Dax smirked, while Kex's fingers flew over the controls. Warning lights began flashing across the display. The shield generator hummed dangerously. Lyra could sense the power building up, becoming unstable. Without thinking, she shoved Dax aside with strength she didn't know she had, sending him flying several meters across the floor. The other students arriving for the exhibition stopped and stared. No one had ever seen an Australian display such physical power. Lyra reached the control panel, her hands moving with impossible speed as she tried to prevent the overload. The shield was seconds from explosion, an explosion that would harm everyone in the hall. Time seemed to slow again. Her mind processed the complex energy patterns faster than any Australian should be able to. With 3 quick adjustments, she redirected the power surge, containing it within a modified shield bubble. The generator exploded, but her modified shield held. When the light faded, everyone stood unharmed, protected by her quick thinking. That was impossible, one student whispered. The reaction time needed to contain that explosion. Did you see how she threw Dax? No Australian could move that fast. Professor Val pushed through the growing crowd, all 4 eyes wide with amazement. Everyone out. Clear the hall. He turned to Lyra. Except you. You stay. As security officers arrived to investigate, Lyra noticed her mother rushing in, still wearing her maintenance uniform. May's face showed pure panic. "You can't question her," May insisted to the officers. "She's just a child. A child who displayed abilities well beyond any known Australian capabilities," one officer responded. "This incident requires investigation." Lyra stood trembling, not from fear, but from anger. "They tried to sabotage my project. They could have hurt everyone." "Lies," Dax shouted, but his antenna twitched nervously. "She's the dangerous one. You all saw what she did." Professor Val raised all four hands for silence. "The security cameras will show us exactly what happened." He looked at Lyra with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Though I suspect they'll reveal more questions than answers." Mai stepped forward, placing herself between Lyra and the others. "If you want answers," she said quietly, "you're not going to like them." The small security office felt even smaller with Mai and Lyra sitting across from Professor Val and two station officers. The security footage played silently on a screen behind them, showing Lyra's impossible movements in perfect detail. "It's time," Mai said softly, reaching for her daughter's hand. "I should have told you years ago, but I was trying to protect you." She pulled out an old data crystal from her pocket. "Your father wasn't lost in a space accident like I told you. He's different." The crystal projected an image that made everyone in the room gasp. A tall figure stood next to a younger Mai, but he wasn't Australian. His skin wasn't blue, but a light tan color. He had no antenna, and his eyes were round, just like Lyra's. "A human," one of the officers whispered, taking an involuntary step back. "But they're forbidden. The ancient treaties." "My husband, Tom, was an explorer," Mai continued, her voice growing stronger. "His ship appeared in a restricted sector where I was doing repairs. He was supposed to be scouting quietly, maintaining the illusion that humans had died out centuries ago." Lyra stared at the image, seeing her own features reflected in the man's face. "All this time, I'm half human. But the stories say they were monsters. Dangerous predators that nearly destroyed themselves." Professor Val leaned forward, his four eyes blinking in sequence. "The stories were propaganda, meant to keep the species separated. Humans weren't monsters. They were survivors. Their ability to adapt, to think quickly, to overcome any challenge, it made the other species afraid. That's why you're different," Mai explained to Lyra. "Your reflexes, your strength, your quick thinking. They're not defects. They're gifts from your father's side. Humans can process information faster than any known species. They can grow stronger under pressure. They adapt." The security footage continued playing, showing how Lyra had contained the explosion. No pure Australian could have done that, Professor Val noted. The processing speed required. "But why hide?" Lyra asked, her voice shaking. "Why didn't Father stay?" May's eyes filled with tears. "Because if the Galactic Council discovered humans still existed, still explored space, they would restart the old wars. Your father returned to human space to protect us. To protect you. The Council must be informed," one officer stated firmly. "No," Mai stood up. "My daughter has done nothing wrong. She saved lives today. Would you punish her for that?" Professor Val raised a hand. "Perhaps. Perhaps it's time for change. The old fears are based on stories, not truth. Look at Lyra. She could have hurt those who tried to harm her, but she chose to protect everyone instead. The Council's laws are clear," the second officer began, but stopped as alarms suddenly blared through the station. "Multiple ships just appeared on our sensors," a voice announced over the comm. "They're not in our registry. Design unknown." May's face went pale. "They found us. They must have detected Lyra's power signature during the incident." She looked at her daughter with worried eyes. "Your father warned me this might happen." "What's coming?" Lyra asked, though somehow she already knew the answer. "The human fleet," Mai whispered. "They've come for their own." Chaos erupted throughout Stellar Academy as students and teachers rushed to the observation decks. Through the massive windows, they could see 5 ships unlike any they'd ever encountered. Their design was sleek yet powerful, without the usual flowing lines of Australian vessels or the crystalline structures of other known species. "Those are human warships," May explained as she and Lyra watched from a quieter corridor viewport. "But they're not here for war. Look at their weapon ports, all closed." The station's communication system crackled to life. A deep, familiar voice spoke, making Mai freeze. "Stellar Academy, this is Commander Thomas Reed of the Earth Expeditionary Force. We request peaceful docking. We're here for my daughter." "Dad?" Lyra whispered, pressing her hand against the viewport. The voice triggered something in her memory. A faint recollection of being held by strong arms, of laughter she'd almost forgotten. Professor Val appeared behind them, slightly out of breath. "The council representatives are demanding we deny docking permission. But," he paused, all 4 eyes blinking rapidly, "they're also terrified of what these ships could do if we refuse." Through another window, Lyra spotted Dax and his friends, their faces pale blue with fear as they stared at the human vessels. The stories they'd used to torment her, about humans being dangerous predators, suddenly seemed to backfire on them. "Look at their hull," Professor Val said, his scientific curiosity overtaking his caution. "The metal, it's adapting to the radiation from our star, changing its properties." He turned to Lyra. "Just like you adapt. Just like you changed the shield properties during the explosion." Suddenly, the largest ship moved, positioning itself directly in front of the main observation deck. Its size made the station look small in comparison, but instead of fear, Lyra felt a strange sense of pride. "The human ships are sending data," announced a nervous station controller over the comm. "Historical records, scientific achievements, cultural information. It's incredible. Their technological advancement. They weren't hiding all these years. They were growing, learning, exploring." May squeezed Lyra's hand. "Your father's people chose peace, but they never lost their strength. They protected us by staying away, by letting the galaxy think they were gone." She smiled sadly. "Just like you protected everyone today, even those who hurt you." Professor Val's communicator beeped. He read the message and looked up at Lyra with all 4 eyes wide. "The council. They're ordering an emergency session. The existence of humans can no longer be denied. And you, Lyra, you're proof that our species can coexist." Lyra watched as a smaller shuttle departed from the largest ship, heading toward the station's main docking bay. Her enhanced senses tingled with anticipation. "Go," May said softly. "Go meet your father. It's time for you to learn who you really are, not just half of each world, but a bridge between them." As Lyra ran toward the docking bay, she passed dozens of students who had bullied her. Now they pressed themselves against the walls, watching her with a mixture of fear and awe. But she wasn't interested in their fear. Like her father's people, she would choose a better way. She would show them what humanity really meant. The docking bay's massive doors slid open with a low hiss. Lyra stood beside Professor Val and her mother, her heart pounding as the human shuttle settled onto the deck. Steam rose from its cooling engines, creating an almost mystical scene. The shuttle's door opened, and a tall figure emerged. Commander Thomas Reed moved with a confident grace that seemed both powerful and gentle. His eyes, the same shape and color as Lyra's, found her immediately in the crowd. "You look just like your grandmother," he said softly, stopping a few steps away. Before anyone could speak further, warning sirens blared through the station. Red emergency lights began flashing. "Critical failure in the main reactor cooling system," the station's AI announced. "Containment breach imminent. All personnel begin emergency evacuation procedures." Professor Val's 4 eyes widened in horror. "The cooling system. If it fails completely, the reactor will go critical. We'll lose the entire station." Commander Reed turned to the station officials. "Let me help. Human ships carry emergency repair crews trained for radiation environments. We don't need human help. One official snapped, even as warning displays showed the situation worsening. Lyra stepped forward. "But you need mine." Everyone turned to look at her. "I can feel the reactor's rhythm, just like I did with my SHIELD project. And now I know why. I have both Australian knowledge of our technology and human adaptability." "Absolutely not," Mag protested. "The radiation levels will kill any pure Australian in minutes." Lyra finished. "But I'm not pure Australian, am I? I'm something new." Commander Reed studied his daughter with pride. "She's right. Humans have enhanced radiation resistance, combined with Australian engineering knowledge. The radiation levels are already beyond safety limits," a station engineer reported urgently. "Then we're out of options," Professor Val said. "Let her try." Lyra ran toward the reactor section, her father close behind. As they reached the engineering deck, the heat was already intense. Through the reinforced windows, they could see the reactor's cooling tanks glowing an angry red. "The main control panel is there," Lyra pointed, her enhanced vision cutting through the steam. "But these readings, the standard procedures won't work fast enough." "Then we adapt," her father said, pulling out a small device. "Human emergency protocols. Sometimes the best solution isn't in any manual." Working together, father and daughter moved with incredible speed. Where Lyra's Australian knowledge identified problems, her human instincts found unconventional solutions. Her father's experience guided their improvisations. In the observation room above, students and teachers watched in amazement as the reactor's warning signals began to fade. "Impossible," an engineering chief muttered. "They're not just fixing it, they're improving it." When Lyra and her father emerged from the reactor section, they found a very different reception than before. The same officials who had rejected human help now stood speechless. Students who had mocked her defects watched in awe. Dax stepped forward from the crowd. We were wrong about you. About humans." Lyra looked at him, then at all the faces watching her. "No," she said clearly. "You were wrong about differences. Being different isn't a weakness. It's how we survive. It's how we grow." She turned to her father, who nodded proudly. "And sometimes, it's how we save each other." News of the reactor incident spread across the station like wildfire. Within hours, ships from various species began arriving, their representatives demanding explanations about the human presence and, more importantly, about Lyra. The station's main conference room had never been so crowded. Representatives from 12 different species sat around the massive table, their attention divided between Commander Reed and Lyra, who sat between her parents. "For centuries, we believed humans had isolated themselves in defeat," a reptilian Dracon ambassador hissed. "Yet here you are, with technology that surpasses our own." Commander Reed stood, his presence commanding respect despite being the only human in the room. "We never left. We watched, we learned, and we waited for the right moment to return. Not as conquerors, but as allies." "And what proof do we have of your peaceful intentions?" asked a crystalline Lumari delegate, their form shimmering with doubt. Lyra stood up, surprising everyone. "I am your proof." Her voice, though young, carried the strength of both her heritages. "Look at what happened today. When the reactor was failing, it wasn't pure human strength or pure Australian knowledge that saved us. It was both, working together." The room fell silent as security footage played, showing how Lyra and her father had saved the station. The impossible speed, the intuitive understanding of the technology, the perfect blend of innovation and expertise. "My daughter represents something you all feared," Commander Reed continued, placing a hand on Lyra's shoulder. "The mixing of species, the sharing of strengths. You called it contamination. We call it evolution." I stepped forward. "For 16 years, I hid my daughter's heritage to protect her. But look what that fear cost us. Years of progress, understanding, growth." Professor Val, who had been quietly observing, activated a holographic display. "These are Lyra's test scores, her project results, her achievements. Not despite her hybrid nature, but because of it. She possesses the best of both worlds. The old treaties, the Drakon ambassador began, but Commander Reed cut him off. The old treaties were built on fear and misunderstanding. Look around you. This station still stands because human adaptability and Australian technology work together. Imagine what else we could achieve. A new voice spoke up from the crowd of students who had gathered at the room's entrance. It was Dax. She saved all our lives, he said, his antenna drooping in humility. After how we treated her, she still chose to risk herself for everyone. Other students began nodding, sharing their own observations of Lyra's actions over the years. How she never used her strength for revenge. How she helped others even when they shunned her. The Lumari delegate's crystalline form brightened. Perhaps it is time for change. The younger generations seem ready. Commander Reed smiled. That's why we chose this moment to return. Not through political channels or military might, but through our children. Through hope. Lyra looked around the room, seeing the mix of species, the blend of colors and forms. We don't have to be afraid of being different, she said. We can be afraid, or we can be amazing. One by one, the delegates began to nod. The future they had feared for so long stood before them not as a threat, but as a promise. In Lyra, they saw not the end of their traditions, but the beginning of something greater. The weeks following the reactor incident brought dramatic changes to Stellar Academy. The once quiet halls now buzzed with excited discussions as human teachers joined the staff, sharing their knowledge and perspective with curious students. Lyra walked into her quantum physics class, no longer trying to hide or blend in. Her classmates had changed too. Where there were once whispers and pointed fingers, she now found genuine interest in questions. Is it true that humans can survive in almost any environment? Asked a young Drakon student, his scales shimmering with curiosity. Before Lyra could answer, Dax spoke up from his seat. They adapt. Like how Lyra adapted the reactor systems. His antenna twitched with embarrassment as he caught her eye. I've been studying human history since that day. Professor Val entered the classroom, followed by a human instructor named Dr. Blake. Today, the professor announced, all four eyes bright with excitement, we'll be learning how human intuition and Australian precision can work together to solve complex problems. During the practical exercise, Lyra found herself surrounded by classmates seeking her help. Her unique way of understanding both the mathematical precision her mother's people valued and the intuitive leaps her father's people excelled at made her a natural teacher. I never thought I'd say this, Kex admitted as Lyra helped him with a particularly tricky problem. But being different, it's actually amazing. You see things in ways we can't. Later that day, in the station's main hall, a ceremony was taking place. Commander Reed stood before the assembled students and staff, with Mai and Lyra beside him. The Galactic Council has officially recognized humanity's return to open space, he announced. But more importantly, they've recognized the right of species to learn from each other, to grow together, and yes, to love across the old boundaries. Mai stepped forward, her hand clasped in her husband's. For too long, we let fear keep us apart. We forgot that diversity makes us stronger, not weaker. Lyra watched as Dax approached the podium, representing the student body. We've established a new student council, he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. One dedicated to celebrating our differences and learning from them. And we want Lyra to lead it. The hall erupted in applause. Lyra felt tears in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. Professor Val handed her a badge, a symbol showing intertwined DNA strands from different species, forming a beautiful pattern. Your bullies have become your biggest supporters, Mag whispered to her daughter. You didn't just prove humans could return. You proved that change is possible. Commander Reed smiled proudly. The real test of strength isn't in standing alone. It's in bringing people together. As the ceremony ended, students from various species gathered around Lyra, eager to share ideas for the new council. She saw hope in their eyes, curiosity in their questions, and most importantly, acceptance in their smiles. "You know what's funny?" Lyra said to her parents as they watched the excited crowd. "All those years I tried to hide who I was, when being exactly who I am was what everyone needed." The station's lights seemed brighter that day, as if reflecting the new dawn of understanding that had begun. In the window's reflection, Lyra saw herself clearly, not half of anything, but completely whole, a bridge between worlds that had been apart for far too long. 1 year after the revelation of her human heritage, Lyra stood at the podium in Stellar Academy's Grand Hall, addressing a very different audience than before. Students from 20 different species filled the room, including several human hybrid children who had finally felt safe to come forward. "When I first came to this academy, I thought being different was a curse," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Now I know it was always a gift, not just for me, but for all of us." Behind her, a massive display showed images from the past year. Human ships and Australian vessels working together on deep space missions, hybrid children playing with pure species kids in new integrated schools, and scientists from different worlds sharing their knowledge. "Look how far we've come," she continued, gesturing to Dax, who now served as her deputy in the student council. "My former bullies taught me something important, that people can change when they open their minds and hearts." Professor Val stepped forward, all 4 eyes gleaming with pride. "The Academy's new exchange program, led by Lyra, has become a model for schools across the galaxy. We've had over 300 hybrid students enroll this year alone." Commander Reed and May sat in the front row, holding hands. Their love story, once hidden in shame, had become a symbol of hope. Other mixed couples in the audience smiled at them, no longer afraid to show their relationships. "But our work isn't finished," Lyra announced. "Today, I'm proud to introduce our newest initiative, the Bridges program." She activated a hologram showing the new space station under construction, a place where all species, pure or hybrid, can come together to learn, grow, and understand each other. Kex, now working as a junior diplomatic officer, stood up. "The Galactic Council has unanimously approved the project. Construction begins next month." The audience erupted in applause as Lyra unveiled more details. The new station would feature adaptive environments for all species, combined teaching methods from different worlds, and research facilities dedicated to understanding the benefits of genetic diversity. "But the most important bridge we need to build," Lyra said softly, "is the one between our hearts and minds. The one that helps us see that our differences aren't walls. They're windows into new possibilities." As she concluded her speech, a group of young hybrid children approached the stage. One of them, a girl with both Drecon scales and human eyes, spoke up. "We don't have to hide anymore, do we?" Lyra knelt down to meet the child's gaze. "No, little one. You never have to hide who you are again." The ceremony ended with a surprise announcement from Professor Val. "The Academy Board has decided to rename our science wing. From today forward, it will be known as the Unity Wing, in honor of the student who taught us all that being different isn't just acceptable, it's extraordinary." As the crowds mingled afterward, Lyra found a quiet moment with her parents. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked them. "When you were hiding me, protecting me, did you think it would end like this?" May smiled, touching her daughter's cheek. "We hoped. Your father and I always hoped." "Hope is a very human trait," Commander Reed added with a grin. "And look what it built, a whole new world." Lyra looked out at the gathered crowd. Former bullies turned friends, different species learning from each other, hybrid children playing freely. She had been the catalyst, but they had all built this future together. The young girl who once hid in shadows now stood proudly in the light, showing everyone that the best parts of ourselves often come from embracing what makes us different.